Hello, everyone. This is me, Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China, based in Austin, Texas, the United States of America. Today, with me to discuss, to continue our discussion, actually, Hegel's Science of Logic is my dear friend, Aran. So, how are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing good, Trent. Good to be with you today. I'm a philosophy instructor based in Austin, Texas, and yeah, excited to continue our conversation on Hegel Science of Logic.
So, in our previous episodes, that Aran night took us like further one step, like by explicating what um really meant to have that as something and other relationship, as we talked about in previous episodes, and we further elaborated the implications of change into like being in itself, being for other, and indicated the not just the Hegel's the understanding of the constitution and the determination, the two pairing qualities, one may say, or characteristics for change or something, but also our tentative, potentially critical remarks over that whole logical process, which would come up after this episode in our retrospect of Hegel's book, Opening Hegel's Logic. So today we're going to talk about the final important parallel relationship in this book of Hegel, namely limit, finitude, and infinity. So will you take us from here, please, Aaron?
Yes. So yeah, one thing that is important in the discussions that we had for the last time, as Trent mentioned, is that the basic idea is this kind of like further clarifying the relation between something and other. But in doing that, the question of identity became centralized. And even if when Hegel doesn't use that term, that is essential. Like, what is identity? What is identity of something independent from others, if there is such an identity? What is it for an identity to change internally and externally? And all of these elements that we talked about through the concepts of in itself, for others, determination, and constitution, is going to be with us in our conversations about all sorts of other topics that we are interested in. You're going to hear us talk critically about them, as Trent also mentioned in the next episode. Now, what we want to do today is to start with the concept of limit uh, that comes right after these discussions about determination and constitution. And it is also as like an extension of this kind of like a differentiation between something and other. And ultimately, what is important is the pair of finitude and infinity. And we'll get there after a brief discussion on the concept of a limit. Now, the way that I understand limit is it's one of those kind of like transitions or like discussions that I'm not entirely sure why we are talking about this. I know one part of why we're talking about this, but I will tell you what is the part that I'm not quite sure about. But like the idea, I think, is that when we're thinking about determination and constitution, we're thinking about identity, of almost identity of something and what is constituted externally. By others, on the top of this identity, which, as we mentioned last time, could be fundamentally transformative. Um, what we necessarily need to have is kind of a border between something and other, right? Because if I want to say this is the determination of something, here is it is constituted by others in a certain way. I'm just saying that here is the beginning of something, is the end of the something. This is it, and it's beyond that, it's not the something, right? Um, and Holgate talks about this in a couple of ways. The last quote that you see here is, I think, the most clear one. He says, insofar as something is the thorough negation of its other, it must differ completely from that other. that means that it must exclude the other totally from itself. That in turn means that the other must actually cease where something else and something itself begins. Something must thus be the limit of the other. Right? So the idea, I think, the basis of the idea is not anything complicated. For all of this to work, there is a point about the border between something and other. And this border, just to make it clear, and Holgate does that as well, is not necessarily anything is spatial, right? It could be very much conceptual, or it is conceptual here, but it could has it is one of those things that is, represent itself in all sorts of other things. To talk about my property, the only way to do that is to just limit like a piece of land or intellectual property even, right? Like something can be my property insofar as I impose a sense of limitation that, hey, this is like where you cannot trespass, right? And trespassing could be spatial, you come to my ranch, or it could be intellectual, you're using my idea to build an app, right? And I think it's the same idea that is presented here. And the way Holge talks about this is that it's, this is further explication, of course, but it is a little bit more, for the lack of a better term, aggressive determination, right? That, hey, this is me, right? Don't, is it like when people talk about set boundaries, right? Like just like, you don't get to talk to me that way, right? That's a boundary that someone sets. I think that's a very much the idea here, that there's something kind of like aggressively imposes its a limitation. And you see this more clearly in like living creatures, for instance, right? That they really kind of push themselves as like, here is where I am, here is what is me and my extensions, and here is you, right? And don't trespass, otherwise, there is a problem. That's how I understand the idea of an limitation. Now, Trev, do you have anything to say about that at this point?
Yes, a couple of things is more like horizontal thinking at this point, but I think one thing just to build on what you said and referring back to our previous episode is that there's a very interesting feature to the world that Hegel conceptualizes. Namely, the world system could not tolerate absolute vacuum. And this concept of limit really, I think, clarifies as why Hegel, in my eyes, thinks that this cannot exist. Because to have an absolute vacuum, that means that we create one-sided limit. Like here you see like limited is two-sided. It's like something is at the same time asserting what I am or it is, it puts limited to the other. But if it is absolute vacuum, there won't be a like hand from the other side to push it and form the limit. That's how I conceptualize this. You can comment on this. And in terms of horizontal thinking, I'm very much in agreement with what you said. Like space and time has not yet been introduced. So what Hegel is saying here is not. It could have like later on spatial like borders as like implication or as a derivative, but here is more conceptual and therefore has like a parallels in our colloquial or commonsensical understanding of many things that are not considered spatial. For instance, institution or bureaucracy, it has like a gatekeeping mechanism. Certain information is tolerated in this like circulation of information within a bureaucracy. Certain kinds of information cannot unless it's been translated into. Therefore, it sets a kind of a limit to a specific, say, office, what it can do, what it cannot do. It's not a spatial, but it also has the same property to a certain extent, and that is self-referential, like information loop, and therefore, like, especially in relation to other bureaucracy, it has that kind of interdependent yet like mutually differentiated property, which I think is the foundation for like cybernetics or information science, or certain social system theory of a society. But this very interestingly has also like analogy or like a counterpart in natural science or natural history to a certain extent. It's like I was reminded of the concept of like a cell. It has its like membrane, which differentiates what's inside internal, what is it outside. So in Hegel's science of logic to its extent, it's a kind of a being very interestingly anticipates perhaps like the concept of life, or what does it mean to have a life, perhaps fulfills a certain structure like necessary in Hegel's concept of like being. So that's what I got like for this slide. Yes, in terms of what limit could inspire us in seeing other things differently.
Yeah, I think these are all very important points. I think it's like, yeah, I think it's first of all the example of life, and the interesting thing about the example of life is that I don't think it's just another example. I think it's very important there.
Mm.
There are a couple of things that I want to say in response to what you said is that like there is this kind of a continuous like question that we've had
Right.
before, and in the critical response we're going to talk about it as well, is that like is this whole thing about limit, because we can think about limit in two different ways in my view. We can say that we cannot have a meaningful concept of something without having a concept of limit, right?
Right.
Like you cannot have a something without having limit, right?
Mm.
And this means this kind of goes back to your brilliant example of like naming last time. That the kind of like naming as the beginning of language that you said kind of like token naming is the first part of kind of like differentiation within a nexus of connections, right? That your name is Tren, now it's just like this is you and this is others. At the same time, they're all involved in this process. Here, you're imposing a limit, right? Now, that's one claim, that there is no coherent concept of something without the concept of other, without the concept of limit, without the concept of negation, all of this stuff that we have talked, right? There is a quite different thing to say that the world is filled with somethings with limits, right? Like turning this into an ontological argument is a very different like act, right? And that also goes for life, right? That yes, if you want to really think about like in a pragmatic way, we want to distinguish between this organism from this other organism. The concept of limits is necessary, right? We cannot do that without talking about limits, and that limits could be go further down in the biological sense, go to like immune system, right, and like kind of like exposing like death. I know from some research that I have done in the philosophy of biology, however, that how contentious this assumption of limits is, and how they are, like modern biology is kind of like getting more and more in trouble of kind of really discovering any real limits between living entities, and like this kind of like coexistence of many different quote unquote organisms that seem to be separate, but they are like all kind of intertwined. In that sense, like limitation becomes an issue as an ontological claim. More clearly, in limitation in terms of differentiation between the species and humanity as opposed to other entities. So I think this is important to put in, like, have in mind that this idea of limitation could be a necessary act in and necessary and real, right? When you talk about institutions, like this institution doesn't make sense unless there's a limitation to its scope and like power of execution. And that is also a real thing. It's not, it's just illusionary. But like when do we make the transition into nature, right? Then like applying the same logic doesn't seem to be granted self-evidently. Like, it just, that needs to be argued. So these points about limits are gonna come together to a lot of things that we have to say about identity later on. Now, there is something in Holgate's interpretation of Hegel here that kind of like is, justification of why we move away from limits. Because remember, the idea of the book or its claim is that, like, these distinctions, these ideas are not just popping up randomly, right? There is a reason why there's a transition from whatever other to change. It's not like another random concept, right? So this is why we we get out of limit and get into finitude. And for Holgate, at least, this is because there's a contradiction at the heart of limit, right? The contradiction at the heart of the limited thing is this, Holgate writes. Something is what it is within or this side of its limit, but without the limit, something cannot be a distinct, determinate thing. So the way that I can think about this quote unquote contradiction is that without the limit, there is no real something to impose the limit. Like, these two things are kind of like weirdly juxtaposed. It is as if, oh, there is a something, it imposes a limit, and now, that's its limit. But without the limit, there is no something in the first place. That's one thing that I get from this. Also, there are, like, other parts of the text. There are some points that Holgate mentions about, the limit being within something and not being within it, right? Being part of the something, not being part of it. It's kind of having this kind of a weird character that any border has. Like, if you're in a border, this is a weird place. Which part are you at? What do you belong to? Is it a third limit? Is its own third thing, like a neutral, zone between two kind of hostile countries, right? Or it is part of each, right? And there are some problems there. I'm not saying this is a critical point. I'm just saying as an explanatory point. I see some issues with this, but I don't see how this gets to the point of internalizing limitation organically, right? And we're going to talk about finitude, and I will explain more what I mean by that kind of internal limitation. But I'm wondering, Trent, about this or anything about limit that you still want to talk about. We'll talk about it, and I will elaborate more on this.
Yeah. Like, well, listening to what you were talking about, that really special relationship between limit and something, like something cannot be without a limit, yet limit is not part of something, reminds me of, like, in mathematical analysis, the relationship, they also use very importantly the term limit. Like, say, zero, the relationship between zero and the infinitesimal small number. Like, if you approach like zero as like a positive number, however much you can, like that, I don't know the word for it. Is it zero then? Like, that relationship is very much, like, in my mind, paralleling like something and limit. In this, we can imagine positive numbers together as something, and a zero will be its limit. That without zero, something, that positive numbers could not of meaning at all, therefore of use or being. But like, zero is not a positive number in the strictly defined way. So yes, that's my response on that. Like, recall what you like responded to my previous comment. I think yes, that's a brilliant point, and we'll discuss more about it. That this important distinction that Hegel's limit and all those terms that provided many implications to think about, or possibilities to think about the relationship between something and other. One is like there can be no coherent making of something without the concept of limit and other. And the other is what we talked about, the vacuum and the gap situation. It's a different ontological claim to say like the whole thing is like without gap. So that's a very important distinction. But we will like recapitulate in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, the point about zero is interesting. Yeah, it has like something that is a limit. There's a limit that is its own character, but it's also like constituting and like both. And like, it's just it's that things get weird because then we wonder, right? Is limit as something, right? Like what is limit in terms of like the language that Hegel has developed so far? And I don't have any answer to that. Like I don't know what a limit is as a concept here that falls into its own thing that is not, related to something or other. Then it seems like we need to talk about it a lot more than Hegel does, but we don't. So here's another, like, here's a point, like an explanatory point. And again, as you've seen, like we like if you guys are listening to this, have an idea about this, just share it with us. We're not sure what really makes this move happen. But in any case, from limit we get to finitude. Now, the way that I understand finitude is the way, like I understand finitude in continuity of Hegel's argument in general by retreating back to that basic point that we have discovered so far, which is this kind of making negation explicit, right? So we got to the point that negation, something embodies negation, right? And then we're just like, okay, if something embodies negation, this negation should be applied to the whole of something other was born. Then another way to think about negation was, hey, this needs to be applied to the something, right? Just like otherness needs to be applied to other. That means that kind of a continuous being negating itself. It must just change, right? It must not remain the same. It just like change and change and change and change and change, right? So that was another point about negation. The way that I understand finitude is the ultimate self-negation of any something, right? It's not like the constitution that is just like this drastic transformation from outside. Hegel puts it as internal decay, right? And the idea is that not only a thing must have an other and must kind of continuously deny itself and redetermine itself, but it must go away. There must be some, like the entirety of something must fade away. That's the ultimate point about negation there, right? And Hegel uses this like kind of a rather eerie poetic language to talk about this. He writes, the being as such of finite things is to have the germ of disease as their being within self. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. The idea is that to be something is to be finite, to have an end. And the way that I understand it is that just like the whole point about negation, right? And there is this point that Holgate mentions that this is about like an application of like two different types of decay and destruction, right? He writes, the finitude and other relatedness of something can, of course, work together to destroy the thing. I think the internal structure and organization can break down autonomously, and at the same time, can be crushed by something outside it. Think, for example, of the Roman Empire, unquote. So the idea is that like this point, like even if there is no external thing bringing radical self-transformation and eradication, even something internally must bring that on, right? And here is just to give a point, like the point. This is one of the things that I'm going to have a very hard problem with, in a critical point, because I'm not sure when we think about like a demise of a living being, and how much this distinction is actually representative of the reality of decay. But yeah, so this is the beginning of finitude, and there are other things that we're going to add to that. But let me make sure what if Trent has something to say here, and then we can move on.
No, I don't have anything concrete to contribute at this stage. Shall we just carry on to next slide?
Of course, yeah. So finitude is introduced in this way, and within a finitude, because this kind of facing demise, right? There is a point. There, the concept that is introduced. It's the concept of ought to be, sollen, right? The idea is that because like it's something cannot live up to what it purported to be, right? And the way that I understand like how this kind of out to be comes to being, comes to the logical being in Hegel's logic, is that whenever you have a concept, whenever you have a something, because that something is ultimately just gonna go through transformation and gonna end, right? What that original idea of something is ends up just being an ought to be so and so, right? And I know this is an empirical concept. I know probably there are many problems with this, but like when you think about a chair, right? A chair, when you have a concept of a chair, you have an expectation at that almost. Of course, it's a pragmatic concept and so on and so forth. But a chair wears out, falls apart, gets destroyed, and it's always this kind of a gap between what it should be and what it actually is. There's always this kind of a what the identity is and failure to completely meet that identity, and ultimately just kind of like collapsing, not meeting that ultimate point. The point about ought to be is almost as enigmatic to me as the point about limit, because to me this sounds like we need to assume that there was an identity in something. Then we realize that there is finitude, there is demise, there is transformation. And then we're going to say, oh, so that original identity that we ascribed to something is just an ought to be, right? But why keeping that part? We thought something is this like identity, so on and so forth. Now we realize it is this, self-transformation, external transformation, and decay and demise and death. Yeah, it's not, and as I said, just the limit. This is more a matter of being mysterious to me than being I have a problem with it, because it seems like that ought to be comes into place if we stick to the original idea of something as having this kind of a very kind of confident structure that is just there. If you realize that it doesn't have that structure, why ought to be? Now we have a different concept. So yeah, that's what I have. I don't have much more to say about this. I think the point of finitude that I understand is that the point about self-negation. And kind of like, if something embodies negation, that negation ultimately means negation as eradication of that something altogether, right? And again, remember, in all of this, Hegel claims, Holgate claims, we haven't introduced time, right? Time hasn't, like, we're not in time. So if you're thinking about finitude without thinking about time, we're going to have some stuff to say about this in our critical remarks. But Trent, do you have anything to say about finitude?
Yes. A couple of things. First, like while reading this, I was reminded of our like episodes on Gillian Rhodes' Hegel contra sociology, in which Zolan or that ought was a really important concept. And she used it to basically do a very alternative type of like historical assessment of concept like French Revolution. And a revolution, to a certain extent, is like when reading this, I'm very much like you. The whole concept as devoid as like abstract terms remain kind of mysterious to me. So, dear listeners, if you have ever any thought on the following things, that you can share that in comment and in other forms, whatever, like the relationship between change, like finite, limited, and finitude. We all welcome that. But what I want to say here is the like Rose type of a lot of empirical application or potential of this concept of ought as it's something like what you just said, like that negation was expressed through proposing a, to a certain extent, essentialized and always lagging concept, an idealized form of something. And it's not necessarily temporal. Say, if we say use the apostles in the New Testament as an example to as a social critique, saying like contemporary like followers of Jesus are not really up to the standard. That is what, in my commonsensical interpretation, a practice of that ought to be. Like you proposed a concept. However, this is, it does not sit very well with something or actuality, as like in our following slides I would explore it, because it's kind of negation. It does not really take into account of the something cannot exist without other, like a constitution must coexist with determination. So I'm with you. Like the way I think about it is I have to turn it into kind of empirical, like a cases, which comes with its limitations or problems. But I think the main picture should be clear at this stage, as you mentioned, like in the slide. Yeah.
Yeah, so I am with you, and like it's interesting like how this gets connected with the whole discussion that we had on Zolan and Julian Rose. It's, yeah, in those cases, I like the way that the Zolan was understood and it presented, and it was fascinating and was very interesting, was that like there is this kind of detachment from the existing social relations. There is this standard that is developed like on top of it, and now tries to kind of like make that social reality into the kind of data standard. Like it's externally exposed, um, externally imposed, sorry, standard on top of something that is not the type of thing that could accept that Zolan, right? So just like it becomes the problem of what is that, kingdom of heaven and kingdom, like the earthly um uh land, like, you know, just a city of God as a city of man, right? Just like that kind of like comparison that just becomes idealized, as you said, right? That, oh, reality is just devoid of morality. Morality is always a Zolan. The world is not going to ever be purified according to these standards, and we are the better ones. We are all the Zolan ones. We remain at the level of Zolan, and in another way, just like any revolutionary attempts, right? That your revolutionary attempt, you're just like, we're gonna go ahead. We have the standard. Existing society doesn't matter. It's just like a moldable form. We go ahead and just like impose on it. And if it resists, it is its problem, right? We have the standard. We have gotten it. We know what is Zola, right? We know what it should be. So we just like trying to like force it into it, right? And I think the contrast here is that what like the placing of this ought to be seems to be very different, because this seems to be, but ought to be is not a category here that is necessarily described as a problem, right? It seems to be just like this is implicitly present in any something. There's this kind of an internal battle. Now, one way that I was thinking about it, it was like, again, going back to life, which again, I don't think it's an accidental thing, right? But I think a living being is a better example of how we might need to understand what Hegel is talking about, as opposed to Rose's understanding of should, right? I think any body is, at least like if we kind of push Hegel's point further, has an implicit kind of, in a very, very primitive sense of the word, conception of health, right? An immune system reacts to change based on an idea, not an idea in the sense of a conscious idea, based on a baseline of health, right? It attacks these things that are alien and they just need to be dealt with, to kind of like keep some level of stability of the living organism, of keeping it alive, right? Of keeping it alive, right? Now I can just, with that, I can see this, there's this constant battle that any body continuously fails to fulfill that like kind of idealized version of a living being, right? It's always kind of like failing in all sorts of ways. This comes back to the art. The art is applied as like very unconsciously in terms of like how, you know, whatever immune system functions, or just like more conscious decision making of how keeping the living going, of more sophisticated animals. So in that sense, there is something that I can see in living beings that have that structure of ought to be, that is not this ought to be of external standard imposed on something that is not fitting it, but is something that is as a constant combat. But yeah, still, this does not really make much sense to me as a logical category, because I remember while listening to Holgate's lectures, I am also, he really emphasized that like for Hegel, ought is an ontological category, right? Ought is something about existence. Ought is not something that is just everything is and then let's talk about ought. Like the gap that they in morality talk about isn't ought distinction. Ought is like kind of implied in any form of existence, right? But I think I have a hard time either understanding it or accepting it as I understand it. But yeah, that's the idea of finitude. I think we have a more substantial things to say with more clarity about the transition from finitude to infinity and different forms of infinity. What I suggest, Trent, is that let's actually end this episode here, because we have a lot to say about infinity, and I don't want us to compromise on the content of that, and restrict this to discussion of limit and finitude, and we will come back, we will like add an extra episode about infinity, and then we will move on to the critical assessment and the summary.
Sounds fair to me, yes.
We appreciate your presence, we appreciate you listening to this. We are gonna be back with the transition from finitude to infinity, and we're going to talk about infinity in the next